Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a very special welcome from here at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies located at Concordia University in Montreal. My name is Csaba Nikolényi. I'm professor of political science here at Concordia and also director of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. Truly such a pleasure to welcome back, I should say, an old friend, Dr. Guy Ziv, who agreed to spend a couple of days with us here in the city, in spite of the cold and the freezing last few days. Dr. Ziv is visiting us in order to bring about this very important celebratory event. And the event is celebratory because we are sharing with you the Montreal launch of his hot-off-the-press new publication, Netanyahu versus the Generals, The Battle for Israel's Future. Now, I did say that Dr. Ziv is an old friend, and that's true, because a few years ago, when he published his previous book about Shimon Peres, when hawks turned doves, Shimon Peres and Foreign Policy Change, we also had the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Ziv here at the Institute and bring that very important book to your attention. Some of you who are joining us on Zoom might very well remember that important event. And that, of course, wasn't the only time that you visited us here in the city and at Concordia, and it's always such a pleasure. We certainly look forward to welcoming you back when you publish your next book, which, looking at the prolific rate of your output, I know is going to happen very, very soon. Dear friends, Dr. Ziv is joining us from Washington, D.C., where he is an associate professor of international relations, foreign policy at the American University of Washington, D.C. And he's also associate director of the Melzer Schwarzenberg Center for Israel Studies, a very accomplished, prolific member of the both the foreign policy, international relations, but specifically the Israel Studies research community. And it's really such a delight and such a pleasure to have him here with us. And without further ado, I would like to, if not, well, actually, we are post-COVID, so I can say I'm delighted to see both the floor and the screen to Dr. Ziv in order for him to tell us about the most important and salient points from his book. And his talk, as always, is going to be followed by a Q&A. As before, I would ask you to please drop your comments and questions in the chat box, and I will do my best to moderate the discussion with sensibility and attention to the important things that emerge. So, Dr. Ziv, please tell us about your new book, and congratulations.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone who's joining us today. I want to give a special thanks to those of you who joined us in person, and also to Csaba Nikolényi and Corey Newman and the Azrieli Institute for hosting me today and organizing this talk. 2 weeks ago, U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who's the highest-ranking Jewish elected official in the United States, gave a historic speech in which he called, I quote, for Prime Minister Netanyahu to call for early elections, essentially, and said that Netanyahu has lost his way by allowing his political survival to take precedence over the best interests of Israel, quote unquote. The Israeli national security community had reached this very conclusion a long time ago. And just last week, the 555 Patriots Forum, which is a group of former Israeli Air Force pilots, issued a statement backing up Schumer's statement and calling on Netanyahu to declare early elections. And to me, this is very relevant to the book I just wrote. And the impetus for my writing this book was because I noticed a very interesting, very intriguing paradox, which was a Netanyahu who has this image, or had this image until recently, of being the nation's Mr. Security, and who spent his entire adult life and career with that kind of image. That's never been an image that has been accepted by the Israeli national security community. And in fact, when you look at statements, interviews, and political leanings of those members of the security establishment who retire and then gone on to politics or been involved actively in civil society, you see that they had never actually seen him as Mr. Security. And in fact, many of them see him as a security liability. And in order for me to explore this intriguing puzzle, I look at both the civil-military relations literature as well as the literature on populist nationalism. These are two distinct literatures that normally are not studied together in order to achieve a better understanding here. I also methodologically, I'm looking at not just secondary sources, but dozens of interviews that I conducted on my numerous trips to Israel with interviews with former heads of the security establishment, including a few active members of the security establishment who chose to remain anonymous in terms of giving me off the record information. And I also met with numerous academics, civil society leaders, and politicians as well to kind of round out the set of interviews. And my key argument is that to explain this puzzle of why the public has chosen, again, until recently, had chosen to see Netanyahu as Mr. Security and vote for him time and again, and discount or dismiss the warnings of the security establishment, I look at the reduced status of the IDF in particular in Israeli society, and how the populist nationalist politicians, especially in recent years, have exploited the space that was created, that has been created in the wake of the reduced clout of the security establishment. And in terms of what it is about Netanyahu specifically that the security establishment disagrees with or doesn't like, there are essentially three factors. One is lack of an agreement, and I'll get to that in a moment, lack of confidence, and lack of trust in the Israeli leader. And I'll start with lack of an agreement. For the security establishment, the key raison d'etre for the state of Israel is to pursue the Zionist dream. And the Zionist dream, in a nutshell, is an independent, sovereign Jewish state that also is a democratic one. And these two elements, democracy and a Jewish state, must go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other to fulfill the vision of the Zionist visionaries and the founders of the modern state of Israel. And so when they look at the policies of the Messianic right in particular, when they look at what many have referred to as creeping annexation, the status quo, which in essence isn't really the status quo because it is leading Israel into a binational reality, they have serious problems with that. And so on the Palestinian issue, and to some extent on other national securities as well, including the goal of thwarting the Iranian nuclear program, the security establishment has had some very significant differences with Prime Minister Netanyahu. As far as lack of confidence in Netanyahu, this actually dates to his very first term as Prime Minister in the 1990s. They see Netanyahu as a man of rhetoric, a man who gives speeches, but they're not necessarily very impressed with these speeches. When it comes to actions, they see him as somebody who has often exercised poor judgment. And as I mentioned, this dates to his first term as prime minister. In September of 96, he decided to open a new entrance to the Hasmonean Tunnel in Jerusalem that sparked major violence, and this was fairly predictable. He also had an incident the following year in which he tried to poison Khalid Mashal, one of the senior Hamas leaders who was in Jordan at the time. And when King Hussein got word of it, this was exposed. Netanyahu then had to send agents back to Jordan in order to administer the antidote. So he ended up having to save the very Hamas leader he had tried to kill. And then more recently, we saw last year the demonstrations against the judicial overhaul. The security establishment, and more specifically, reservists from elite units played a key role in the pro-democracy and anti-judicial overhaul legislation. I'll get to that a little bit later. And then, of course, the October 7th Hamas massacre was the single biggest incident of terrorism in the country's history. And this all took place under Netanyahu's watch. So there's lack of an agreement, lack of confidence, and ultimately lack of trust in Netanyahu, because from the perspective of most members of the security establishment, as well as retired senior security officials, Netanyahu has increasingly looked out for his own political survival, putting his personal and political interests ahead of the national security interests. I want to say a few words about civil-military relations in Israel. Although the Israeli military is subordinate to civilian control, as is typical the case in democracies, what is not so typical compared to other Western democracies is that the Israeli military has a much more active role in political life than is typically the case. Yoram Perry refers to what he calls a partnership between the generals and the politicians, and oversight has never really been all that strong, even though a coup has never been a realistic possibility either. And the most visible manifestation of these kind of blurred lines between the military and political establishments or spheres is the very unique Israeli phenomenon of ex-generals who, upon retirement, enter political life in Israel. In fact, 3 of Israel's 13 prime ministers were retired generals, 2 of them former chiefs of staff, and the vast majority of IDF chiefs of staff end up running for office. What's also very interesting is that most of these generals, when they do enter politics, they tend to join parties or foreign parties or join other parties that are to the left of the dominant right-wing Likud party. That's Netanyahu's political party, of course. And one trend that we've seen is right-wing prime ministers from Menachem Begin to Yitzhak Shamir to Benjamin Netanyahu picking ex-generals to serve as their Minister of Defense, in part to offer legitimacy or to help legitimize their premiership. Yet there's also a pattern of most of these defense ministers ultimately clashing with their right-wing bosses and leaving. We saw this with Moshe Dayan, who was not the defense minister, but the foreign minister of Menachem Begin, who left when he realized or came to the conclusion that Menachem Begin was not serious about his pledge to have autonomy talks with the Palestinians. And his defense minister, his first defense minister, Ezer Weizmann, also resigned a year later for a similar reason. Yitzhak Shamir had Rabin for many years as his defense minister. Rabin ultimately left the government, challenged Shamir, and defeated him in the 1992 elections. And Yitzhak Mordechai was Netanyahu's first defense minister during Netanyahu's first term, and he too left and formed a centrist, a new center party with the IDF chief of staff, the outgoing IDF chief of staff, Amnon Lipkin-Shahak, and they too tried to challenge Netanyahu. It was actually Ehud Barak, another former IDF chief, who ultimately defeated Netanyahu in those 1999 elections. And this kind of re-election defeat, this first re-election defeat of Netanyahu in 1999, really convinced him that his chief rivals were the very popular ex-generals. And not surprisingly, during his years in the political wilderness as the opposition leader, he orchestrated the passage of what was known as the Haaretz bill or the Haaretz law. Dan Haaretz was a then popular IDF chief of staff, widely expected to run for the top post. And to try to prevent that from happening, Netanyahu's allies passed this bill that lengthened the cooling off period from 6 months to 3 years. And their argument was this is part of the democratic process, and it's to prevent conflict of interest. And so in theory, that actually sounded like a good deal. In practice, it was aimed to thwart the ambitions of the then popular generals, because by the time they would be eligible to run, either they would be too old or they would just, their luster would be gone. And that was the idea behind that. We saw in recent years with back-to-back elections that produced a political stalemate in Israel, we saw an unprecedented occurrence where 3 former IDF chiefs of staff teamed up in one political party to challenge Netanyahu. A couple of them have since left, but others have since joined. The most recent one being Gadi Eisenkot, who was Benny Gantz's successor. Over the years, the IDF has had quite a bit of influence in Israeli policy. Their autonomy has been manifested in many ways. We saw in the 1950s, for example, Ariel Sharon, who was then a young elite commander of Unit 101, who carried out counterterrorism raids without the approval of then Prime Minister Moshe Sharett. By the mid-60s, it became common, even the norm, for journalists to interview chiefs of staff and generals. Yitzhak Rabin was then the IDF chief of staff, and he would give interviews on political issues, which, again, is not the norm in Western democracy. In fact, it was the generals who in the 60s pushed a very reluctant Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol, to preempt the Six-Day War. They were hoping and trying to convince him to pursue this war in 1966 when they felt Israel had the strategic advantage. Eshkol was reluctant to do so until he felt that he would get the approval he needed, or at least the amber light, from the U.S. President, Lyndon Johnson. In the 1980s, the same Ariel Sharon that had orchestrated those counterterrorism operations without the approval of his boss, as defense minister, gave orders to assassinate Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. And it was actually officials in the army, including IDF intelligence heads and others, who defied his orders. They were able to locate and pinpoint Arafat, but they refused to carry out their order. Later in the late 1980s, in the wake of the first Palestinian Intifada, it was the IDF chief at the time, Dan Shimron, who pushed for a political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in order to try to at least end the Intifada and achieve some sort of deal. And it was, and the IDF continued to play a role in peacemaking and the peace process in the mid-1990s, even after Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated and Shimon Peres took over as the caretaker prime minister. He continued to bring in the senior heads of the security establishment into the decision-making process. All of this was stopped. All of this was put to an end once Netanyahu came to power. The general's status in Israeli society has evolved quite a bit. Traditionally, the IDF has been viewed as the people's army, an important source of national pride, of identity, of social integration that embodies the Zionist ideals. And generals were once seen in Israel as heroes. And you look at Moshe Dayan, you look at Yigal Yadin and others who were seen almost in mythological terms. That changes with the first major debacle, and I'm referring here to the Yom Kippur War, of course, in October 1973. And since then, there have been other disasters or perceived disasters that have further reduced the clout of the IDF. And here I'm referring to all of the Gaza wars, including maybe even the current one, the first and second Lebanon wars. The first Lebanon war, often seen as Israel's Vietnam, and the second Lebanon war, 2006, was basically produced a stalemate, which by many standards was seen as a loss for Israel in a sense. So the fact that a non-state actor, Hezbollah, was able to make such gains and deliver such a blow to Israel and resulting in this stalemate, also not seen as a success story here. So the clout of the generals has really been reduced. I would add two other factors other than the wars. The decision to withdraw from the Gaza Strip in the summer of 2005. This was, of course, Sharon's disengagement plan when Sharon was prime minister, was backed by generals and senior members of the security establishment who supported the disengagement from the Gaza Strip. And, of course, the association that the security establishment had long had with the Oslo peace process, seen as a failure, also further diminished their clout. So it's against this backdrop that nationalist politicians in Israel have attacked the security establishment as part of their populist playbook. Now, I should note that Netanyahu and the current his current allies, who are often seen as the populist nationalists that we often hear about and read about, their provocative statements. This is not Israel's first experience with populism. Menachem Begin was actually Israel's first populist prime minister. But as Danny Filk has noted, Begin's form of populism was a much more inclusive form of populism. He was able to tap into the frustrations of the working class, of the working poor, of the Mizrahi in Israel, the Mizrahi community that had been treated as second-class citizens. He was able to bring them into the mainstream in Israel, and in that sense, even though he employed populist tactics, it is regarded as a more inclusive form. In contrast to Netanyahu's form of populism, which is seen as much more exclusive, and it's much more about us versus them. And us, the common people, we, the common people, are different than the left, the leftists, the Arabs, the elitists. And this is what makes it much more exclusive. And we've seen, ever since Netanyahu's re-election in 2009, we have seen a slew of bills. The most controversial one is the Jewish nation-state law of 2018, which declares Israel the nation-state solely of the Jewish people, omitting any reference to minority rights or equality. These are values that are incorporated into Israel's Declaration of Independence. Israel doesn't have a constitution, but it does have a Declaration of Independence, as well as basic laws that determine its laws, and equality is nowhere mentioned in this controversial legislation. And there were other illiberal bills as well. The media, both traditional and social, has served as a major vehicle for Netanyahu's populist nationalism. He, on the one hand, attacks the media as being against him and against being his government, but at the same time uses the media as well for his own political ends. His son, Yair, is a close advisor to his father, even if an unofficial one, and has his own social media accounts and uses those social media accounts to attack senior members of the security establishment. To this very day, he is highly critical of the current IDF chief, and this is part of Netanyahu's way of attacking the security establishment for the failures that led to October 7th. But before we get to October 7th and the current situation, I want to point to two very important incidents in 2016 that served as inflection points. The first is the Elor Azaria case. Elor Azaria was an Israeli soldier who was filmed shooting an unarmed Palestinian terrorist, but he was already subdued, didn't represent any threat anymore, and Azaria went ahead and killed him. As I said, this was captured on camera, and his commander promptly arrested him for having violated the IDF code of ethics. A brouhaha ensued, and the media and many members of the public, including some of the more right-wing media channels, latched onto this issue and blamed the commander and the heads of the army for not protecting their own, not protecting the soldier, the common person. And this is something we heard, of course, from Netanyahu's political allies, eventually from Netanyahu himself, who called Azaria's parents and expressed support for the release of their son. One of the major incidents that led the then defense minister, Moshe Ya'alon, a Likud politician, a right-wing politician, who nevertheless, as a former IDF chief, was outraged at this reaction and these illiberal trends in Israeli society, and quit his post and became a rival and challenger to Netanyahu. The other incident was a speech given by the then IDF Deputy Chief of Staff, Yair Golan, speaking at the Holocaust Remembrance Ceremony. He called on Israeli society to do some introspection, talked about the buds of intolerance, the buds of violence, the buds of self-destruction, and made some comparisons to the Weimar Republic that many Israelis did not find welcoming, to say the least. He was attacked promptly by populist politicians on the right and ultimately denied a promotion to IDF chief. Today, he is a politician on the left running for the Labour Party. The assault on the security establishment is a very significant development in Israeli politics and society. I mentioned earlier the fact that the IDF has long been considered the People's Army, so it's highly unusual to attack the People's Army. In typical democracies, keeping the military in check is a sign of democratic robustness. But in Israel, the IDF, and I'd like to add to the IDF, the other security institutions such as the intelligence units, the Mossad intelligence agency, the Shin Bet security service. These institutions serve as gatekeepers to Israeli democracy. There is a then popular documentary, a well-known documentary called The Gatekeepers, in which 6 Shin Bet heads or ex-Shin Bet heads were interviewed and talked about their roles during their tumultuous terms in office, and to this very day, the IDF and the Shin Bet and the Mossad, and to some extent the police as well, serve as a gatekeeper of Israeli democracy. So we're seeing increasingly, and we've been seeing increasingly, especially since 2010, but even more so since that pivotal year of 2016, ongoing attacks by allies of Prime Minister Netanyahu on the security establishment. I'll give you a couple of illustrations here. David Bitan, who is one of Netanyahu's allies, has complained that Israeli intelligence chiefs have become leftists in their posts. He complained that the cabinet's hands were tied because the IDF chief was not recommending operations in Gaza back when Eisenkot was the IDF chief to quell border unrest. He referred to the Shin Bet as cowardly. Miri Regev, another Netanyahu loyalist, called the Shin Bet delusional. And there have been numerous attacks on the IDF as well and on the Mossad chief as well. And as I mentioned, Yair Netanyahu, the prime minister's son, routinely attacks all of these figures on his social media platforms. The interesting result here is that we have seen in Israel a deterioration of public trust in the nation's institutions. Obviously, the Supreme Court and the media and other institutions have been attacked routinely, and we've seen those numbers go down. But also, interestingly, the IDF remains the most trusted institution in Israel. About 86% of Israelis still to this day, and this is a very recent, this is based on the most recent poll conducted several weeks ago. To this very day, despite the attacks, the IDF remains the most trusted institution in Israel. And after the Gaza war, or after the beginning of the Gaza war, 23% of Israeli Arabs who trusted the IDF before the war, in the aftermath of the attacks, 44% of Israeli Arabs said they trust the army. So in other words, there's been a rise among Palestinian citizens of Israel, or Arab Israelis, a rise in their trust to the IDF. Every poll taken since October 7th have found Israelis trusting the IDF significantly more than their government, than their prime minister, and than their government. Which leads me to last year, 2023, and a very pivotal year. And the reason this is a pivotal year is because this is the year that Netanyahu lost his image as the nation's Mr. of Security. First, we had the 2023 judicial overhaul legislation. Netanyahu was basically giving his ministers the ability, the backing to support legislation that would ultimately weaken the Supreme Court. Every one of the coalition partners had their own reason for wanting to do so, including Netanyahu himself as the nation's first sitting indicted prime minister who's under investigation. All of the political factions wanted to see a reduced clout and influence of the Supreme Court, and the public wanted to see none of this. And in fact, the majority of Israelis supported the demonstrations. We saw weekly demonstrations. Among the demonstrators were key security official or former senior security officials and reservists. And the reservists here, the IDF reservists from elite units, played a key role in the demonstrations. The morale of the IDF took a big hit, prompting Netanyahu's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who had supported up until that point the judicial overhaul legislation, to call for its suspension. Netanyahu then promptly fired his defense minister. That led in turn to spontaneous demonstrations all over the country in support of the defense minister, and Netanyahu had no choice but to reinstate him. And to this very day, Yoav Gallant is still the defense minister, but very much at odds with the prime minister. This was a turning point because this was the moment that many Israelis, including many of Netanyahu's voters, people who voted for Netanyahu in the previous elections of 2022, concluded that their prime minister was looking out for his personal political interests and not putting national security, as his defense minister was putting first. And of course, October 7th is the other major event in 2023 that Israelis are still reeling from. The most significant terrorist attack in the country's history. And what we see in the aftermath of October 7th is one security official after another taking some sort of responsibility for what had happened, from the IDF chief to the IDF intelligence chief to the Shin Bet head. The one person who, as of today, has not taken responsibility for the tragic events of October 7th is Netanyahu himself, of course. I want to mention three implications of this research. The first is that Israeli democracy hangs in the balance, and we don't yet know who is going to prevail. Will it be the populist nationalist politicians, i.e. Netanyahu's allies, or perhaps will it be the gatekeepers of democracy that will prevail, who very much are putting up a fight? And this is all part of a broader cultural war in Israel that has escalated dramatically in the past year. Second implication is U.S. Israel relations. And we've seen a growing partisan divide over Israel. We've seen that in recent years, but we're seeing it much more so today. It's an election year in the United States, and the Democratic Party is very much split. But even traditional supporters of Israel, I mentioned Chuck Schumer earlier, are very critical of the direction in which Israel is heading. There may even be some repercussions financially, militarily, diplomatically, and otherwise in the coming months and years. And finally, there will be significant economic ramifications for an illiberal Israel. Israel may cease to be the startup nation for which it is famous. Last year, Moody's Investor Services warned about negative consequences if the government went through with its judicial overhaul. And just last month, Moody's lowered Israel's credit ratings. So it's very possible that Israel's investors will be scared away, and that Israel's human capital, the nation's top asset, are going to accelerate the brain drain that we've seen over the years. I'd like to end on a positive note by emphasizing 2 points. The first is that the pro-democracy movement that we saw last year was inspirational in a lot of ways. Over 20% of Israelis took part in one or more of the weekly demonstrations. And as I mentioned, Army reservists played a very key role in these demonstrations. So the resilience of these demonstrations offers a masterclass to others who in other countries who are facing illiberal forces, and so far that seemed to have placed the judicial overhaul on the back burner, even though it's not completely dead. And lastly, tragic events can sometimes bring about positive change. I know it's hard to be optimistic in light of what we're currently seeing unfold in the Gaza Strip, but we have to keep in mind that 4 years after the Yom Kippur War, the devastation of the Yom Kippur War, Anwar Sadat made a surprise visit to Jerusalem and addressed the Israeli people in the Knesset, leading to a breakthrough at Camp David and the subsequent Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. We also saw how the first Palestinian Intifada led to the Madrid Peace Conference and the Oslo Accords as well. And it is quite possible, quite conceivable, that an American-brokered Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement, something that both President Biden and former President Trump would like to see, could lead to a two-state solution down the road. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for this topical, timely, and very insightful talk. Before I would turn to the chat and share some of the comments and questions that might be raised by our online attendees, let me just take a quick look around the room and see if anyone from here would like to raise a question. And of course, we can come back, but I want to give the in-person attendees the first chance. If not, yes, Dr. Krodes.
Yeah, thank you so much for that interesting and insightful talk. It's very much out of my field of expertise, but I'm very familiar with some of the history that you've been discussing and, of course, current events. So I have something, a methodology question. How do you sort of mobilize ethnographic fieldwork, interviews and such to ascertain things like lack of trust with something so unreliable as, human recollection or someone uses ethnography quite extensively in my own research, but for very different purposes. I'm curious, how do you work with that material?
So first of all, I wouldn't call my own methodology ethnographic, even though there's some overlapping methodological overlapping methods of inquiry here. But I complemented published interviews. Should I look? Where should I look when I'm answering the question?
No. Be natural. I think let's look at each other.
Okay, I'm looking back here. But I complemented published interviews, published letters, open letters, published opinion pieces, statements put out by these ex-security officials with my own interviews, and I also interviewed not just those who are, say, closer to the political left, but those who are more right-leaning as well. And even if they disagree, they might disagree on some of the specific issue policy recommendations, for example. They're not necessarily going to be at odds over Netanyahu, the trends in Israeli society, the ideas that are discussed. The goals are similar. The goals are similar, even if the means are not always the same.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. So let me follow up and firing away a salvo of 3 questions, which are kind of related, but I would like to end on a counterfactual. My first question has to do with the way you put the context and the reaction next to each other. And in particular, you mentioned, Guy, that when the populist attacks on the IDF started, the IDF was already suffering from a declining cloud, if you will. And you mentioned some of the military debacles, Israel's Vietnam, the first Lebanon war, etc., which created an opening. So one could read this in many different ways. One could also read then the IDF's and retired generals' growing interest in entering political life as a way of reversing that. So how do we... What's the chicken and what's the egg, if you will? So what comes first? Is populism, are the populist attacks on the generals and other security establishment the product of the IDF's already weakening clout and stature in Israeli society? Or do you think it would have happened anyways? So that's for one question. And I just want to base the 3 so that you would decide which one, if any, you want to answer. And of course, you may decide that they are not particularly helpful in general. My next question has to do with the exclusive populism. And I find this distinction very, very helpful to think about Begin and Netanyahu as an inclusive populist, the former, and exclusive populist, the latter. But something I need to wrap, or I have difficulty wrapping my mind around when I think about Netanyahu as an exclusive populist. Maybe not so much today, because I think today it's appropriate. I understand the metaphor. But if I look at the way he built his coalitions, certainly since 2009 when he comes back to power, between 2009 and 2019, he has formed governments with all of them. With Barak, he's the former prime ministerial contender, he brought in his coalition as defense minister. Yair Lapid, we don't talk about this much today, but Yair Lapid was a member of his cabinet, as was Tzipi Livni. So Netanyahu really worked with pretty much everyone other than the Arab political parties and Haaretz until 2019, when, even before judicial reform, there was the Raklo Bibi mobilization. So again, chicken or egg, so which came first? The us versus them, did it precede or did it follow sort of the isolation and the strategy on the part of the left and the center forces to try to displace him once they were no longer regarding him as a coalition partner? And my last question is really on the same point on which you concluded, the Saudi deal. As a counterfactual, I just want to tease you to it. If October 7th hadn't happened, and maybe we would have already celebrated the conclusion of the Saudi deal, but let's imagine that's the counterfactual. how would you have changed, if at all, your sense of the tense relationship between him and the security establishment, which of course was already had a history by that point? I guess a different way of asking this: what was the view of the security establishment about the looming Saudi deal? Was that something on which they actually agreed? Or was that something that the security establishment warned him against? Don't go forward with that deal too quickly until you have given something to the Palestinians as part of it. Because there were these two different strategies: focus on the outward in or inside out. And it seems that Netanyahu certainly favored the outside in strategy. So those are three questions, and please, whatever makes sense to you.
So thank you for three very good questions, and I'm going to try to answer them in the order in which you asked them. With respect to populist attacks, so Ami Peditzur, years ago, you may recall his book on the right, on the rise of the radical right. And so we already saw years ago attacks by the right wing on various institutions in Israel, like the courts and the educational institutions and the media, of course. And I would add to Ami's list the IDF, which happens after Ami's book. And as I mentioned, this takes place later. When we're asking about the chicken or egg debate, this takes place later. It would have been unheard of to attack the IDF even 20 years ago. And so this is a more recent phenomenon. And I would also add that Netanyahu himself is very careful to avoid direct attacks on the IDF or the Mossad or the Shin Bet. He has his allies do it. He himself is careful not to do so. His son does it, and people around him does it, but he himself doesn't do so. So this is a much more recent phenomenon, which leads me to my answer to your second question about Netanyahu's exclusive populism. So you're absolutely right. Over the years, Netanyahu has put together various coalitions, and more often than not, he would have a centrist element or even center-left element in his coalition to balance out the far-right factions that I think Netanyahu himself was not comfortable with. That's changed. And the reason that's changed is because Netanyahu, as somebody who's under indictment, as somebody who, at least in theory, may go to prison. I'll be surprised if that happens. But in theory, may go to prison if the trial goes the wrong way for him. He felt, I think, that he had no choice but to work with anyone who would work with him. And the centrist and center-left factions, and certainly the left-wing parties and the Arab parties, all said, we're not going to touch this one. We're not going to go into a coalition with them. And so that led Netanyahu to bring in the most radical, most marginalized elements of Israeli society. Somebody like an Itamar Ben-Gvir, who I don't think Netanyahu would have had anything to do with up until 5 years ago. Netanyahu felt he needs them. And so he orchestrates the merger of these far-right parties because he feared that running alone, they would not enter the Knesset, i.e. he would have no coalition. And that explains, I think, his shift in that regard. And so red lines that may have existed for him changed. The red lines have changed over the years. And then finally, with respect to the Saudi deal, I don't know if there's a consensus or strong opinions one way or the other among the security establishment. I'm sure they would love to see normalization with all Arab countries because that would enhance Israel's security situation in the region. So I don't think there's any real opposition. I don't know if there's necessarily a strong inclination to support an inside-out or an outside-in approach. I think where they really differ with Netanyahu and Netanyahu's coalition is on the Palestinian question. And for members of the security establishment or senior members of the security establishment, the idea of Zionism is to take the initiative. Zionism has always taken the initiative. And they see a status quo-oriented prime minister who has not taken the initiative on this. In fact, the the running premise for Netanyahu all these years was, I, as Mr. Security, can manage the conflict. It doesn't have to be solved. There is no real solution here. I can kick the can down the road indefinitely. Leave it up to me. I'll manage the conflict. And this, they disagree with him well before October 7th. I mean, this is why I wrote the book. I wrote it before October 7th. So I think that October 7th only reinforced this notion that is a false premise, that is a flawed premise, that you cannot ignore the Palestinian issue. It's not going to go away by itself.
Thank you so much. We have a fast-growing number of questions, so let me just share some of them. And I do want to ask for advance apologies to anyone whose question we may not be able to get to. There's a very important conceptual question based by one of our online attendees. And the question has to do with how to interpret the relationship between the military and the populist political leadership. More specifically, the question is whether you think the military as a liberal force today in Israeli politics, or whether it's better to interpret the relationship between the conflict between the military and the populist nationalist circles as just two versions of really populism. One, a nationalist civilian one, and the other one is military. Or do you see, in other words, are these both just different types of illiberalism, or do you see the military definitely in the liberal camp?
I see the senior forces in the military as being part of the liberal camp, but we're seeing a gap that has been growing over the years between conscripted soldiers, young soldiers, who let's just say Ben-Gvir's and Smotrich's far-right message or messianic message resonates more with the soldiers than it does with the top brass. So I would draw a big distinction because of the growing gap between the soldiers and their commanders.
It's very interesting in that regard that you mentioned the Azaria case back in 2016. So in that particular case,
and that's accelerated since then.
Yeah.
That gap has grown since then.
Another question asks you to look into a crystal ball and speculate about the likeliest way for this government to fall.
Well, I predicted a Hillary Clinton landslide in 2016, so I'm not sure I'm the best person to make political predictions. I really don't know how this is going to go. I think that we're looking at the end of Netanyahu's political career. So whether we're looking at another few months, half a year, maybe a year, once this war is over, there's a very good chance that he's going to be history. When that happens, we're going to see a reshuffling of the deck. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Nobody knows who's going to be a successor in Likud. What's the political constellation going to be looking like? What we do know is it'll be different because Netanyahu is kind of this outsized personality, and nobody else comes close to him in terms of their political clout. What we also know is that most Israelis self-identify as right-wing. I think you and I spoke about this last night, in fact, right? So most Israelis identify on the right, and so you might have a center-right or various configurations of a center-right coalition in the future, because the left has all but disappeared.
Another question asks you to look into a different kind of crystal ball, and that crystal ball wants to show you the future of Israel, that ultimately your book really wants to speculate about. Now, you ended the talk on two positive notes. Mm-hmm. Is that because this is how you think about Israel's future? Are you seeing, and here way beyond the post-Netanyahu era, how do you see the long-term trajectory of the Jewish state?
Well, I think that you have enough forces in Israel today that are fighting for its democracy, that are fighting for its survival as a Jewish and democratic state. I can't help but be somewhat optimistic that in the long run, these forces are going to prevail. We don't know what's going to happen in the immediate term. And I think that much of it, as I said, will depend on a post-Netanyahu era. on how this Gaza war ends, on what kind of relationship Israel is going to have with the United States in the coming years. So I have more questions really than answers. But as of now, the liberal forces, democratic forces in Israel have not given up. And so because they haven't given up, I refuse to give up the hope that they will ultimately prevail.
That's a beautiful message to share. So thank you so much. Let me just look around the room to see if there are any questions, comments from the in-person attendees. So let me give it to Ellie and a couple more comments from online.
Yeah, so it's a general question. What do you think about the influence of October 7th and after what's happened in Gaza? How do you think it affects Israel's future, like in terms of international, to Israel?
Well, I think a lot of Israelis are still shell-shocked by the events of October 7th. The rest of the world has pretty much moved on. And I think a lot of Israelis are at a loss to explain why so many of their allies and friends, people overseas, have not viewed the gravity of October 7th in the same way. I think that is something that is very painful to many Israelis, including those on the left, not just the mainstream. This is going to change, I think, things forever. We don't know how it will change things forever, but one thing's for sure is I don't think Israel can go back to October 6th. That I think is, we have entire communities in Israel that have been displaced, both in the southern part, bordering Gaza, and in the northern part, bordering Lebanon. And as of today, they don't have the sense of security to move back to their homes. So they're not even back to where they are. Many of these communities in the south, of course, have been devastated. So I think this is going to take a long time for rehabilitation. And ultimately, even though very few people are talking about it today, ultimately it will have to result in a political process of some sort. Again, not something I think Israelis are willing to discuss today, but something that will have to happen because there's only a political solution, a diplomatic solution, not a military solution.
Yeah, and sorry, just
of course, yes, please carry on.
The military solution that Israel has started, right? With Gaza. So how do you see that? Like, I'm curious to know your opinion about the side.
There's a consensus in Israel that Hamas needs to be destroyed.
Yeah.
Where I think the consensus breaks is whether they can be destroyed. And here we see another gap between the security establishment, including former IDF chief Gadi Eisenkot, who is currently serving in the National Security Emergency Government. There is really not this strong belief in the security establishment that Netanyahu can achieve the goal that he's promising of quote-unquote total victory. Total victory is just not in the cards. And that is Netanyahu playing to his base, but not something that is realistic, which is why I reiterate that while the majority of Israelis support military action against Hamas, it is increasingly clear that Hamas, which was greatly underestimated by both the security and political establishments before October 7th, it was underestimated in terms of its abilities and willingness to inflict the pain that they caused. But ultimately, it is going to have to be a political solution that will really change things.
Thank you very much. So the two last questions that I promised to share from the chat so have to do with foreign policy and international relations. One of them zeroes in on the role of Qatar. Would you comment on your understanding and perception of the role that Qatar has been at a large and seemingly increasing role that Qatar has been playing in managing the diplomatic, if you will, background of this conflict? And how do you evaluate that? That's one question. And another question from one of our current students would like to ask you to comment on the effect of the American abstention from the vote in the Security Council earlier today, and how you think that might play into the relationship between Netanyahu and the security establishment.
So Qatar is a problematic mediator here. Problematic in the sense that they have been very close to Hamas, hosting senior Hamas political officials in their country, working with them, delivering aid, of course, to them. That Netanyahu, I should note, enabled these money transfers to occur over the years. So it's problematic but necessary mediator. They're needed in any sort of, I cannot imagine any sort of ceasefire deal, even a temporary truce, let alone a long-term ceasefire, without the active participation of Qatar, who has that sort of leverage on Hamas. And the second question, I think, also deals with leverage, because the abstention that just occurred in the Security Council is a symbolic step that the Biden White House is taking to remind the Israelis that the Americans have some leverage on them as well.
Thank you very much. So this brings our Q&A to a conclusion. We did promise to let you go just a few minutes after 1 o'clock, but I would like to once again ask members of the audience to join me, if not a real but a virtual round of applause to thank Dr. Ziv for visiting us here in Montreal and sharing this very important summary and discussion about your new book. And once again, we offer our congratulations. And we look forward to more continued scholarly engagement with you. And as I mentioned earlier, please don't be a stranger. Visit us again. It doesn't have to be on the occasion of your next book, but more and more broadly speaking. So and friends in the room, as well as friends on the screen, please remember that Dr. Ziv's talk certainly has not concluded our busy spring semester set of activities. We will be meeting in the same space, same room, both virtually and in person on April 2nd, when Dr. Shlomi Balaban, visiting us from Sapir Academic College, another institution that was very badly hit on October 7th with many, many losses, but his particular focus will be on the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. So consider joining us on April 2nd, and as well as future activities. Everything that we do and organize is widely posted, so you can find up-to-date information on our website, on our social media. And should you have ever questions, any questions, please send us an email. And as we advertised, our in-person attendees are eligible to receive a copy of Dr. Ziv's book, which we are going to be organizing the shipment for you. So thank you very much. I'm wishing you a safe journey back home. And thank you, friends, for joining us today.